In this day and age, we have relatively affordable 500, 600, 700 horsepower plus vehicles. 400 horsepower may not seem like a lot, but back in the day, crossing the 400 horsepower barrier was a huge, huge milestone. And I'll admit that this is 400 gross horsepower, not net horsepower. Gross horsepower being a horsepower rating where the engine is rated absent the exhaust system, the accessories, the air cleaner. So it's a more generous rating than a net horsepower rating. But still, 400 horsepower was a true barrier for a number of years for vehicles. And I thought it was interesting to comment and share what are the first American cars that broke this 400 horsepower threshold? Because it's not going to be from a brand that you would think. Now, you might think that it's a sports car like a Chevrolet Corvette, or maybe even a Camaro, or some souped-up Mustang, and you'd be wrong on all counts when it comes to the 400 horsepower war. So what is this engine that you've been staring at here? Well, this is a Super Marauder 400 horsepower engine. It's a little bit of a trick question to say what was the first American car with a 400 horsepower engine under hood, because the engine that you see here was optional in any of the 1958 Mercurys. Not just the Turnpike Cruiser or the Park Lane, for instance, or the Monterey. You could get it in any of those. You could get the 400 horsepower Super Marauder V8 under hood in any Mercury that you wanted. So the correct answer is the 1958 Mercury lineup. And here's an example of a vehicle that could be equipped with this 400 horsepower Super Marauder V8. In fact, this very Mercury that you see here, 1958 Turnpike Cruiser, is equipped with the Super Marauder 400 horsepower V8 engine that you just saw. And I have to say the 1958 Mercurys have this homely look to them, the face that only a mother could love. It's just a funky, crazy car, especially the Turnpike Cruiser, that has these horizontal antennas that are sticking out at the top of the windshield that I don't think I've ever seen that on any other car. Take a look here. Isn't this just about the craziest thing you ever saw at the top of a vehicle? Like I said, I don't think I've ever seen another car with horizontal antenna like this. But let's talk a little bit more about under hood and where did Mercury get this 400 horsepower from? Well, the answer is from an engine that was launched in 1958, and that was the MEL, or Mercury Edsel Lincoln V8 series of engines. Now, the particular MEL V8 that we're talking about here displaced 430 cubic inches. And it was offered, like I just said, in the Mercurys, Edsels, and Lincolns. As an example, the Lincoln Continentals, the Premiers, etc. of the era, you could get this MEL V8 in them, beginning with the 1958 model year, but they made 375 horsepower in the Lincolns and 400 horsepower in the Mercury. So what was different between the Lincoln and the Mercury? Well, the principal difference was the use of 3 two-barrel carburetors coupled with an aluminum intake that you see here. And with respect to the carburetors, they were vacuum-operated outer carburetors. In other words, the engine principally ran on the primary carburetor that you see labeled there in the middle. That's the one with the choke flap. So that's what the car normally ran on. And then if you depress the accelerator, let's say all the way to the floor, then the outer carburetors would open in conjunction with the throttle opening diaphragm assemblies that you see also that are called out there. And so this combination of the 3 two-barrel carburetors in conjunction with the hotter cam would give the MEL V8 and the Mercurys a bit more horsepower, 25 more specifically than what was offered in the Lincoln, for example. Now, unfortunately, the MEL V8 would kind of decrease in horsepower each year, at least for the next couple of years. It would go down in the Lincoln's 350 horsepower, then 310 horsepower in 1960, as it got a 2-barrel carburetor atop its 430 cubic inch V8. This was the Robert McNamara era of Ford, and Robert McNamara generally thought 4-barrel carburetors were excessive. So the MEL V8 had to make do with a 2-barrel carburetor for a number of years. That was true, by the way, for Mercury as well, where the top Mercury engine, the MEL V8 for 1960, also made 310 horsepower because of that 2-barrel carburetor. But in 1958, Robert McNamara had not yet mandated a two-barrel carburetor atop the MEL V8s, and so you could get a 400 horsepower V8 in any Mercury that you wanted. Now, one note on a couple more facts about the Super Marauder V8 underhood. I did mention that the principal modifications included that aluminum intake as well as they were Holley two-barrel carburetors, but there actually was not a hotter cam that was needed to push this engine from 375 horsepower in Lincoln configuration, 365 horsepower in base Mercury configuration, up to the 400 horsepower mark that Mercury was so desiring at that point in time. Remember, this was at a time period in which the Chrysler 300s were making high 300 horsepowers, like 390 horsepower, and Mercury just wanted something that would put it over its edge, and they enlisted the help of an individual named, I think it was pronounced Bill Strope. Now, he was an individual who was well known as an engine builder as well as an off-roader at the time, and he had suggested the 3 two-barrel carburetors, the aluminum intake, and in addition, a hotter cam. But as I mentioned, Mercury found out that it could achieve 400 horsepower without putting a hotter cam in the engine. And so these particular engines just have the same stock cam that the other 430s have, but have a different carburetor setup. Now, another interesting fact about this particular Mercury Super Marauder V8 was that air cleaner, this aluminum piece that was designed by a former Ford designer and famous hot rodder, Lynn Wineland. And it gives this Super Marauder V8 a pretty awesome look when you pop the reverse hinged hood. Of course, Ford was big into safety during this time, so a lot of Fords had this hood that was hinged at the front, and you would rotate it open in a backwards fashion. But it's one of the coolest air cleaners, if not the coolest air cleaner that I've ever seen on a classic vehicle, and clearly houses those 3 Holley two-barrel carburetors. Now, what happened to that 400 horsepower Super Marauder V8? Well, it was around for just 1 year. For in 1959, as you can see from this page, from the 1959 brochure, the top Mercury engine in 1959 was just 345 horsepower, a far cry from the 400 that we mentioned from 1958. And part of that was that the MEL V8 was detuned a bit. In the Lincolns, as I mentioned before, it went down to 350 horsepower. Here in the Mercurys, down to 345. But notice the Mercury's also, let's say, advertising this engine differently. Responsive, quiet, economical power is what it says here. Nothing really about performance, just quiet and responsive power. So I'm not quite sure what happened here, but it was not just a Mercury issue. As I mentioned, the overall MEL horsepower went down. I believe the compression ratio went down a little bit too as part of the decrease in horsepower. And I think just during this time frame, there was a lack of emphasis from Ford or desire to emphasize fast cars and speedy vehicles, probably prompted by the rise of Robert McNamara, as I said, who mandated the use of two-barrel carburetors on a number of these MEL V8s. Now, one last point I will close with is that, as I mentioned, this 1958 Super Marauder engine was available on any 1958 Mercury. You could get it as a dealer-only option in other Ford products like Lincoln, but it was not a factory-installed engine. You had to order it over the counter from the dealer, and you also wouldn't get that awesome aluminum air cleaner that you saw in the previous pictures. That was a Mercury exclusive. So the engine wasn't entirely a Mercury exclusive. Like I said, you could get it from the dealer, but the factory installed offering with that super awesome aluminum air cleaner was really the way to go. So what do you think? How did Mercury do with this introduction of the 400 horsepower engine? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.